There should be no illusion that Israel is prepared to return to the conditions that existed a week ago. We have fought alone for our existence and our security, and are therefore justified in deciding for ourselves what are the genuine and indispensable interests of our state and how to guarantee our future. We shall never return to the conditions prevailing before. These words were uttered in a public speech by Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol soon after Israel's decisive victory in the Six-Day War. Eshkol, considered a moderate in Israel, made quite clear that instead of leveraging its huge victory to foster a sustainable peace, Israel would continue on its path of settler-colonial expansionism and genocide. This ensured that the Middle East would continue experiencing insecurity, turmoil, and wars as long as the settler-colonial Zionist state of Israel remained the strongest entity in that region. I am Dr. Hassan Bukhari, and this is the 17th episode of our series, Palestine versus Israel. In this episode, we will discuss the Six-Day War of 1967 in detail. Israel faced Arab armies on the Syrian, Jordanian, and Egyptian fronts. I will discuss each front separately. By far, the strongest Arab military was the Egyptian one. Despite the fact that 50,000 Egyptian soldiers were still stuck in the Yemenian quagmire, Egypt had significant forces available. Nasser committed 100,000 of his soldiers and 930 tanks, which represented almost all of his available armored units, to the Sinai. At the outbreak of war, the mobilized Israeli defense forces numbered around 250,000 men. Israel's Southern Command, headed by General Gavesh, was deployed on the Egyptian front. There were about 70,000 soldiers and 800 tanks in this force. The Egyptians showed much confusion regarding their war planning in the lead up to the war. The original Egyptian plan was named Kahir. According to this plan, the Egyptians would just leave a thin screen on the border, lure the Israelis into the Sinai desert, and then encircle them through mechanized thrusts from the north and south. Due to political reasons, Nasser chose not to activate the Kahir plan. He didn't want to surrender the border regions, especially Rafah, Gaza, Abu Agela, and Al Arish. So, Nasser left his forces strung along the border without a concrete offensive or defensive plan. Another great handicap hindering Egyptian planning was the Egyptian Chief of Army Staff, Abdul Hakim Amir. A very incompetent commander, Amir had performed very poorly in the 1956 war, but he was a friend of Nasser and had built patronage networks in the army. So, he was retained in command due to political expediency. The Israeli plan was based on surprise and speed. They wanted to achieve early air superiority and then engage the main Egyptian forces as close to the border as possible in a mechanized battle in order to wipe them out. The Israeli planning was so meticulous that they had even built a full-scale model of the pivotal Egyptian defensive position of Qatif in the Negev desert. Israeli formations practiced and planned for months on end on this model to attack the Qatif position. In Howard Sacker's words, by the time of the June War, the Israelis could have found their way blindfolded through Qatif. On the morning of the 5th of June 1967, Israel launched its preemptive strike. The Israeli intelligence had done its job perfectly. As a result, the Israeli attackers knew the location of all Egyptian planes and anti-aircraft batteries. They even knew when Egyptian pilots flew their morning patrols and when they landed for their morning coffee break. On the other hand, the Egyptians were fast asleep. Their intelligence was woeful, and Nasser had chosen to ignore the warning given by King Hussein of Jordan the previous day that an Israeli strike was imminent at around 8 a.m. Egyptian time the next day. At 8:45 a.m. Egyptian time, Israeli air attacks hit 10 air bases in 3 waves of 40 aircraft each. In 3 hours of mayhem, 320 out of a total of 340 Egyptian combat aircraft were destroyed. Israel lost only 19 planes. At noon, Israeli aircraft launched attacks on and destroyed the Syrian and Jordanian air forces as well. The Israeli victory in the air was so quick and so complete that even the Israeli high command had difficulty in believing the claims of the pilots initially. After achieving air supremacy, the Israeli army smashed the Egyptian border positions. The heavily fortified position of Abu Ghela Qatif was captured on the first night of the war. The Israelis also quickly captured the important town of Al-Arish, located about 45 kilometers from the border. Only Gaza offered some resistance, and the Israelis failed to capture it on the first day. The Egyptians had clearly made the worst possible start to this war, but they still had significant forces present in well-defended positions throughout the Sinai. They could have held on and tried to stall the Israelis while their government tried to arrange a ceasefire quickly. But after the setbacks at Abu Ghela and Al-Arish, the Egyptian army chief Abdul Hakim Amir panicked and ordered a complete withdrawal from the Sinai. Trevor Dupuy writes, "The Egyptian staff was therefore completely unprepared for Amir's withdrawal orders. With the Israeli momentum built up during the first day and half of the war, this retreat order would probably make it impossible to coordinate the defensive efforts east of the canal. Thus, not only would it probably result in the loss of all of Sinai, it would also well mean the destruction of much of the Egyptian army by the pursuing Israelis." By the 8th of June, the Egyptian Sinai army had been annihilated, and Israel was in full control of the Sinai Desert and the east bank of the Suez Canal. The Egyptian government then meekly accepted a ceasefire, and the war on the Egyptian front ended. About 17,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Egypt also lost almost all of its air force and heavy equipment. For example, Egypt lost 700 out of its 900 odd tanks. Israeli casualties numbered just 1,300 killed and wounded, with 61 tanks destroyed. Now let's discuss the Jordanian front. I mentioned in the last episode that just days before the outbreak of war, King Hussein of Jordan had signed a mutual defense pact with Egypt. According to this pact, King Hussein agreed to let an Egyptian general command his forces. General Abdul Munim Riyad was thus dispatched with Hussein for this purpose. Just after the Israeli strike, Egyptian Chief of Army Staff Abdul Hakim Amir sent a cable to General Riyad informing him of the situation. Amir's cable was full of lies. It said that 75% of the Israeli planes attacking Egypt were destroyed and the preemptive strike miserably failed. It further said that now the Egyptians had taken to the offensive. Amir also ordered Riyadh to open the Jordanian front in synergy with the Egyptians and launch an offensive promptly. Interestingly, the Israelis were well aware of the unfortunate tendency of the Arab high commands to hide unpleasant facts, and they would take full advantage of it. Howard Sacker writes, "The Arab tendency to camouflage unpleasant facts in fantasy was similarly exploited. Thus, anticipating enemy victory claims, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan ordered a blackout of war bulletins during the first day of the war. When the Egyptians thereafter claimed destruction of the Israeli armed forces, the Russians stalled United Nations moves for a ceasefire. By the time the Soviets discovered what actually had happened, too much time had elapsed to salvage Egyptian fortunes. It was also too late for Hussein to retrieve his fatal blunder of entering the war." On the morning of 5 June, King Hussein and General Riyad initiated operations against Israel from the West Bank. Israeli enclave of Mount Scopus in Old Jerusalem and the city of West Jerusalem were shelled, and all the Jordanian armed forces were shifted across the river and deployed in the West Bank. The Jordanian army had 55,000 soldiers organized in 8 infantry and 2 armored brigades. Opposing it were 6 brigades of the Israeli Central Command and 4 brigades of the Israeli Northern Command. An armored division of 2 armored brigades was also available to Israel on this front. Israel also had complete command of the air. Like the Egyptian front, the Israelis gained a swift victory in the West Bank as well. But unlike the Egyptian army, the Jordanians fought much more tenaciously and inflicted significant casualties on Israel. The primary target of Israel was East Jerusalem, which contained the holy sites of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. A fierce battle raged in the city for 2 days. About 5,000 Jordanian soldiers commanded by Atta Ali fought well, but were forced to withdraw and abandon the city after 2 Jordanian efforts to link up with them were smashed by Israel. About 1,000 of Atta Ali's men were killed and wounded when on the morning of 7th June he decided to vacate Jerusalem. Thus, after 19 years of Jordanian rule, the holy city of Jerusalem fell to the Zionists. The Jordanians were defeated elsewhere in the West Bank as well. Ramallah fell on 6 June, whereas Bethlehem, Hebron, and Nablus fell on 7 June. On the same day, Jordanian forces evacuated the West Bank. At 7:30 p.m., King Hussein delivered a speech and urged Jordanians to fight till the last drop of blood. But he had already approached the UN for a ceasefire, and at 8 p.m., a ceasefire was declared after Israeli assent. The campaign had resulted in Israel gaining complete control of the West Bank at the cost of 3,000 soldiers killed and wounded. Jordan lost 3,100 soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Almost all of the Jordanian armed forces were destroyed as well. Lastly, there was the Syrian front. Interestingly, the Syrians, who had exhibited much belligerence in the lead up to the war and had constantly taunted both Egypt and Jordan for being soft on Israel, lay almost completely quiescent as Israel mauled Egypt and Jordan. From the 5th of June to the 8th, the Syrian front lay completely quiet, apart from the Israeli air raid that destroyed the Syrian Air Force on the first day of the war. By the 8th of June, Jordan and Egypt had been decisively defeated, and Nasser himself advised the Syrians to accept a ceasefire because he worried that the Syrians might dally in accepting a ceasefire and invite an Israeli attack that would ruin their armed forces as well. Syria, for once, took this advice and accepted a ceasefire at 5:20 p.m. on the 8th of June. However, the Israelis would have none of it. They didn't want Syria to escape unscathed. Thus, they launched a full-scale attack on the Syrian front on the 9th of June. Trevor Dubai writes, in what was a clear violation of the ceasefire, which Dayan reports straightforwardly in his memoirs without apology or explanation, he ordered Al-Azhar to attack as soon as his units were in place. He then innocently adds that the ceasefire went into effect a day and a half later. Israel's primary target on the Syrian front were the Golan Heights, from where Syrian artillery had frequently lobbed shells into the Galilee. The Syrians had concentrated 8 brigades into Golan, but the Israelis could now bring all their might to bear on them with complete command of the air. Within 24 hours, after a sharp battle, Golan was captured by the Israelis at a cost of 750 soldiers killed and wounded. The Syrians suffered 1,900 casualties. On the 10th of June, Israel finally proclaimed a ceasefire and the 6-day war ended. Before we begin to discuss the aftermath of the war, it is pertinent to discuss a somewhat bizarre episode of this war, the USS Liberty incident. USS Liberty was an American intelligence gathering ship that was sunk by the Israelis in the Eastern Mediterranean on the 8th of June. Historian Charles Smith has discussed this incident in detail in his book Palestine and the Arab-Israeli Conflict. Despite apparent Pentagon and CIA support for an Israeli attack, especially into the Sinai, Israeli planes and torpedo boats attacked an American intelligence gathering ship, the USS Liberty, on June 8, killing 34 and wounding more than 70. The ship was stationed off the Sinai near Israel to monitor radio signals from all sources. The Israelis probably acted to forestall American awareness of their plans to move against Syria. Johnson and his aides accepted Israeli apologies for the accident, but believed that the Israeli attack was intentional. The most recent research based on Israel's ground control tapes of the events indicates that Israeli pilots were ordered to attack and sink the ship if it was not Israeli. Later, arriving torpedo boats attacked after identification of the ship as American had been made. Smith further mentions, official US inquiries have backed Israeli claims that the attack was a mistake, but prominent American military officers have argued that the investigations were shams and that the evidence backing the claims of a deliberate assault was suppressed. The USS Liberty incident is another proof of the fact that the license to kill enjoyed by Israel is probably even more liberal than the USA itself. No other country could have got away completely scot-free after such a brazen attack. After all, the US destroyed Iraq and killed millions based on a hoax. The Zionist entity holds such power over the US political and financial systems that even a direct attack on the US military can't bring the US to act against its so-called ally. Here it is pertinent to ask the oft-asked question, why did the Arabs lose so badly? They had huge amounts of good quality Soviet weapons, they had large populations, and even though they hadn't used this edge to gain heavy numerical superiority on the field, their numbers in battle were more or less equal to the Israelis. If the Israelis had the numerical edge in the West Bank and the Golan Heights, Egypt had a significant numerical advantage in the Sinai. So, then why did the Arabs become the vanquished in probably the most one-sided war in the post-World War II era? The most commonly offered explanation is that Israel was leaps and bounds ahead of Arabs when the human element was concerned. Certainly, the Israelis were way more competent, dedicated, and educated than their Arab counterparts on all levels, from simple soldiers to prime ministers and chief of general staffs. Especially, Arab leadership was horribly abysmal. Michael Haydo, the British ambassador to Israel, was on point when he said after the war, Arab leadership on almost all fronts was inept to a degree which hardly seems possible after 10 years of preparation and training for a war which was to bring about Israel's annihilation. But does the factor of Arab incompetence completely answer the question? To me, it doesn't. If Israel had better quality human material, the Arabs had more than 10 times the quantity. Many nations weak in industrial and technological development have defeated their superior opponents. For instance, Vietnam and Afghanistan managed to humble both the superpowers during the Cold War. The Arabs could have mobilized their whole population and fought a people's war instead of a conventional one. In a conventional conflict, Israel held all the advantages, but the Arabs could have avoided it and fought a war more suited to be advantageous to them. Professor Shahid Alam has explained this point quite eloquently. Instead of creating a mass base among their people and preparing for a long-drawn people's war against a technologically superior adversary, as the Vietnamese or Algerians were doing, the Arab nationalists sought to match Israel on its own ground by acquiring modern weapon systems from the Soviets. Their hollow radicalism became a trap for the Arab nationalists. Without Israel's sophisticated industrial, educational, and scientific assets, the Arab nationalists should have known that they could not win conventional wars against so advanced an adversary. Yet, the Arab nationalist leadership never departed from their commitment to fighting conventional wars against Israel. Not even repeated defeats in their wars with Israel in 1948, 1956, 1967, and many smaller encounters besides could persuade them to rethink their strategy. The petty bourgeoisie Arab regimes were not willing to make the sacrifices demanded by a guerrilla war. They also knew that their people could not be inspired to fight a people's war in the name of a newfangled secular Arab nationalism. I will elucidate this point by just giving the example of Egypt here. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was a robust organization deeply rooted in the society. But the so-called Arab nationalists, led by Nasser, viciously tried to demolish it. Here was an organization that had the trust of the people and could be used to get the Egyptian society together and galvanize it for a long drawn out people's war. But the goal of the Arab nationalists was wealth and power, just like the monarchies they had displaced. So they considered the Muslim Brotherhood a threat and tried to eliminate it. They failed because deep-rooted popular movements are almost impossible to destroy by naked repression. But they ensured that a large and more vibrant part of their population would be taken out of the equation when it came to fighting Israel. Repressive at home, corrupt to the core, and incompetent while being bombastic, the Arab nationalists pushed the Arab countries into wars with Israel that were bound to end in disaster. Arab nationalism completely failed to bridge the gap between the Arab people and Arab governments, just like the Arab monarchies preceding it, and the military dictators or the dynasties that replaced it. This gap is the real Achilles heel of the Arabs, and this is the major reason for the fact that Arabs lag behind Israel in every aspect, be it war, economy, society, education, or motivation. At the end of this episode, I will briefly discuss the aftermath of the Six-Day War. In this war, the Arabs lost almost all of their Soviet-supplied heavy military equipment. According to Michael Oren, all but 15% of Egypt's military hardware, $2 billion worth, was destroyed, and vast stores, 320 tanks, 2 SAM missile batteries, and 10,000 vehicles became Israeli booty. However, this loss was repaired as soon as the equipment was replaced with Saudi and Soviet generosity. But Israel had also conquered 42,000 square miles of Arab territory, and that loss couldn't be remedied. The loss of those territories resulted in huge economic losses for Egypt and Jordan. William Cleveland writes in his book, A History of the Modern Middle East, Egypt was deprived of the revenues from the Sinai oil fields and the Suez Canal, which remained closed to shipping from 1967 to 1975. Jordan lost not only the West Bank, its most productive agricultural region, but also the tourist sites of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The Golan Heights were not a major economic loss for Syria, but Israel's occupation of them placed the Israeli forces within easy striking distance of Damascus. General Chaim Bar-Lev, then Deputy Chief of Staff in the IDF, was spot on when he declared to the Israeli cabinet, "We have screwed every Arab country." Another important impact of the 1967 war was that it discredited the Arab nationalist regimes in the same way the defeat in the 1948 war had discredited the Arab monarchies of that era. Arab nationalism was destined never to recover from this setback. Israel's stock in US assessments also skyrocketed after the 1967 war. US aid to Israel multiplied many times as the Jewish lobby successfully sold the concept to US policymakers that Israel was the only country in the Middle East strong and reliable enough to guard US interests. Professor Shahid Alam mentions, annual US aid to Israel averaged $65 million from 1952 to 1970. It jumped from $71 million in 1970 to $601 million in 1971. And the trend since was upward until the early 1980s. The average annual aid flow for the period 1971 to 1980 was $1,081 million, marking a nearly 17-fold increase over the average annual aid flows for the previous period. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank following the Six-Day War resulted in more than 100,000 Palestinian refugees entering Jordan. Many of these were forcibly evicted by the occupation forces. Hundreds of thousands of remaining Palestinians in the West Bank became a huge pool of slave labor for Israel. Most of the menial jobs in Israel, like rubbish collection, dishwashing, and construction labor, began to be outsourced to the Palestinians of West Bank. The prosperous West Bank was ruthlessly exploited in true colonial fashion by Israel. David Gilmour, while discussing the aftermath of the Six-Day War, wrote, "The decline of the West Bank since 1967 has not been unintentional. It is the direct result of the policy of the Israeli government, which has chosen to exploit the area as well as Gaza for the advancement of its own economy. The relationship between Israel and the occupied territories is like that between a colonial power and its colonies." The Israeli lawyer Felicia Langer has described this relationship and its development, how the West Bank with Gaza became a not so small pool of cheap labor, a market of Israel's products, its land a place for settlement, and its wells a source of black gold. Despite this newest rape of Palestine by Israel enabled by the latter's victory in the Six-Day War, there was a silver lining for Palestine. The Arab nationalist saviors of Palestine were decisively defeated. Now, for the first time in 20 years, Palestinians again came to the fore in the struggle of their own homeland. Israel had always tried to deny the Palestinian identity altogether or submerge it in a larger Arab identity. But after the Six-Day War, the Palestinians reaffirmed their identity with renewed vigor. Partially freed from patronizing Arab overlords, Palestinian nationalism experienced a huge surge and ensured that Palestine would not die. A seasoned observer put it quite succinctly. A central paradox of 1967 is that by defeating the Arabs, Israel resurrected the Palestinians. In the next episode of Palestine versus Israel, we will discuss the Battle of Karama, the Black September incidents, and the war of attrition between Egypt and Israel. Stay tuned, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.